Hello, hello, my dispatchers, my listeners. I'm your author, your narrator, your host, Scipio Eruditus. And today I am honored to be uh, joined by Raymond Ibrahim, prolific author and public speaker on the Middle East and Islam. He is the author of 11 books, including Defenders of the West, Sword and Scimitar, and then his latest book coming out on November 25th, The Two Swords of Christ, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about today. But Mr. Ibrahim, if you could just introduce yourself to the audience for those who are unfamiliar with yourself and your work.
Yeah, sure. Raymond Ibrahim. I don't know where to start, but I've been involved in this field for quite some time. My family, from a personal point of view, is Coptic Christians from Egypt. So I was born here, but of course, I grew up sort of very familiar with what happens in the Middle East, the Islamic world, Muslim Christian relations. I had a natural interest, obviously, growing up in it. Hearing that, and also grew up bilingual, speaking Arabic and English, traveled to the Middle East frequently, especially in my youth and in my latter years. And but also sort of professionally and academically ended up in this field. Academically, my focus has been history, minoring in philosophy and English, and I very early on gravitated towards this nexus of Christian-Muslim interaction, especially in the medieval era and the early Islam, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. My thesis was about one of the first military conflict, the Battle of Yarmouk, and the chair, my mentor, essentially professor and still friend, was Victor Davis Hanson. People get a kick out of that because he's become so popular. And anyway, after that, I went to Georgetown University and continued my postgraduate studies, but I never finished PhD because the exigencies of life got in the way and I had to move. And long story short, but I also worked at the Library of Congress in the Middle Eastern department and dealt with a lot of books that deal with the topics that I discuss. So I've had a long background in it. My first published piece came out, I think, in 2005. So we're talking about 2 decades now. And in these more recent years, I've been I used to write a lot about just Islam in general, Islamic doctrine, Islamic terrorism, the modern era, and a lot about the persecution of Christians. Because again, like I said, for personal interest reasons.
Sure.
And I even have a book about it, Crucified Again. I actually just recently, it just got real. I only recently managed to reprint a few copies. Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War Against Christians. But in my more recent years, I've gone back to my initial interest, which is history. And I've been writing a lot of books like Sword and Scimitar, Defenders of the West, the new book, Two Swords of Christ, examining once again where I had left off in my college years, the sort of long war, the historic war between Christendom and Islam specifically. And yeah, so I've been a fellow at various think tanks and done a lot of other kind of, other than my writing, my book writing. And now I have a new YouTube channel, or it's rather old, but it's new because I only started recently kind of posting videos and doing other things, of course, that I can't necessarily even talk about. But yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, that's a good place to start, right? The beginning of all this, contrary to how often this issue is framed within popular media and academic circles, right? The Christian and Islamic relations did not begin, in 1095. So if you could just walk us through the early history of, some of that conflict.
Well, yeah, I think that's very important. And in fact, the way you just framed it is very important because 1095 is the beginning of the First Crusade. And to so many people in the West, especially in America as well, when you talk about the historic conflict between Islam and the West or Christendom, it always starts at 1095. And in fact, and there's a reason for that because the academics have pretended that that's where it starts. I actually made a video and I've written a lot of articles about one quote from a Georgetown professor who I knew, John Esposito, who back in the day, in the 2010s and so forth, was very popular. And, he was the editor of the Oxford series on Islam. And, all these intelligence and political agencies would reach out to him for his consultation about Islam, etc. And he said, and I've quoted it so many times that I think I've memorized it verbatim, but he has a sentence in his book called, I believe the book is called Islam, the Straight Path. And he says 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians elapsed before an imperial papal power play led to a series of so-called holy wars, which have left centuries of misunderstanding and distrust from Muslims towards the West. So what he's saying is that those 5 centuries that he's referring to is everything before 1095, before the First Crusade. And he's trying to say that before the First Crusade, there was nothing but peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians, and it all started thanks to those pesky crusaders and their imperial papal power play, etc. Well, the reality, and as I really document it in my my first real major book, I actually had pulled out all these books because I'm doing something with them, so I have them here. But anyway, this book, Sword and Scimitar, 14 Centuries of War Between Islam and the West, that book was based on tracing the history of conflict between Islam and the West. And the First Crusade is halfway through the book, actually a little past it. It's chapter 5. There's 8 chapters. Okay, so the First Crusade is chapter 5. What does that tell you? The first 4 chapters actually deal with how Islam conquered and terrorized 3/4 of Christendom before the First Crusade. Okay, so for example, it's almost axiomatic amongst Westerners that North Africa and the Middle East, MENA, everything from Turkey and I always in my head I'm confusing past and present names, but to give them their present names, all the Middle East basically. Okay, so Syria, most of Iraq, modern day Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, PA territories, Egypt, all the way west. Okay, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. People think that's always been Islamic. In fact, that's really been more Christian than Europe historically. So on the eve of Islam, when Muhammad came to power in the 7th century, that area was the heart of Christendom. It wasn't Europe, really. All you had in Europe, the main center, of course, was Rome. But in the east, you had Constantinople, you had Alexandria, you had Antioch, you had Jerusalem. All of those are the 5 centers of Christianity. And those 4, other than Rome, got conquered in the name of Islam permanently. And Rome was even raided in the 9th century by Muslims. In fact, the walls that are around the Vatican were built precisely to fend off against Saracen pirates who came frequently in the 9th century and even later. So anyway, the long and short of it is Islam waged a total war on the Christian world, on everyone, actually. They went further east, of course, conquering Persia and India, portions of India and further on. And later on, of course, they went into sub-Saharan Africa. But for our purposes, if you want to talk about the West, they conquered, like I said, all those Christian regions by the sword through violence. And that's what I get into in the book. I actually, what I do is I always go to the primary sources. I'm done I look at secondary sources just to find proof of their malfeasance, these academics, and how they lie and misrepresent. But if you go to the primary sources, it was a total all-out jihad. And it's articulated just the way ISIS. So when ISIS gets up and boasts about how our ancestors, the Islamic ancestors, conquered and they beheaded and they gave Christians 3 choices, or everyone, Christians, Jews, and everyone, or the people of the book, 3 choices, etc. Yeah, that's actually true. That's what Islamic history teaches. That's what Western history in its own way also teaches. Obviously, in early Western Christian writings, they didn't even know what was going on. They just know these are Saracens who had a hatred for the cross, okay, because they very much would break it and desecrate churches. So that's how they saw it in the 7th century. I'm thinking of people like Sophrinus, the patriarch of Jerusalem, for example, who was an eyewitness. But anyway, so this goes on and on and on. And I don't know where you want to end off or if you have more specific questions, but I mean, we can spend I can just keep rattling and talking about this long history because I got 14 centuries to cull from. But, it goes on to, let's just put it this way, in 1 century after Muhammad dies, his traditional death date is 632. In 732, Islam has conquered essentially 2/3 of what was then the Christian world. North Africa, the Middle East had already conquered Spain and now is in the middle of France because 732 is the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers. And even after that battle, people think it was a great victory. It was, but after that battle, they were still all around southern France and in the Mediterranean, and went on to conquer virtually every Mediterranean island. which is, of course, what led to the attack that I mentioned on Rome itself. I believe it's around 850 or so the year. But and then after that, so that's before the Crusades. The Crusades was essentially, uh, that had happened. Christians in Europe were now sort of the embattled. Europe became the final bastion of Christendom. Okay, the final holdout, except for Spain, which was conquered, and they continued experiencing more aggression and violence. And then, right before the First Crusade, you had a new sort of wave of persecution, because this is when the Turks come to power, especially the Seljuk Turks, and they're now Muslims, and they're following the whole logic, jihad logic. The enemy's the infidel. We give them the three choices. If they don't convert, we kill them, etc. And so right before the First Crusade, beginning really in the 1030s, I'd say, they started coming in and conquering Asia Minor, which is today Turkey, and horrific slaughter, especially of Armenians, Georgians, and Greeks. The further west you go into Asia Minor, and if you consult someone like Matthew of Edessa, who's a near contemporary, I think he's writing in the 12th century, just a few decades after the First Crusades, a couple decades, I think, after the First Crusade. And the numbers that he gives of, well, it was just mass carnage. When people talk about the Armenian genocide, in the early 20th century, late
Yes.
19th century, they forget that this has been going on for actually a millennium before that. Turks have been genociding Armenians, and it comes out in his writings, Matthew of Edessa. And he literally talks about tens of thousands of Christians being slaughtered, thousands of churches being torched and desecrated. Okay, and then the same Turks were also attacking. They at one point they essentially conquered Jerusalem and most of the Holy Land from the Fatimids, who were in Egypt, a Shia dynasty. And at that point, they really started, a new uptick in the persecution of European pilgrims who were coming to the Holy Land as well. Okay, and very graphic stuff happened to them. They would assault them, kill them, demand more money,
Yeah,
jizya,
some of the
sometimes
just
take it.
most evil stuff imaginable.
Yeah, and the most evil one that was well recorded and well recounted, and I believe 1064 was a large German pilgrimage that went, and they slaughtered everyone, and they took this described as a very beautiful nun and gang raped her until she died. And the chronicler says, who was really based on an eyewitness, says, and these shameless men did this to all the pilgrims. So all of that coalesced, the violence happening to the Eastern Christendom, the violence happening to Western Christians in the Holy Land, pilgrims, coalesced with the emperor, the Eastern Roman emperor, begging for help from the West. And then Pope Urban in 1095, that's when he preached the First Crusade. And everything I just said, all that graphic stuff, he mentioned as well. Okay, so that's really what started it, but that's not how it's presented now. It's presented now, as I told you, 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, right, between Muslims and Christians, until these evil imperial papal, Catholic power play decided to go and just kill Muslims for the heck of it, because they're just colonialists and they just want to take their land, and has nothing to do with helping fellow Christians or trying to help to save the Holy Sepulchre, the church that was built on the resurrection site, which was also being attacked and was destroyed in the year I believe 1009 by the Fatimid Caliph Hakim Amrullah, who razed it to the ground. And that actually called a sort of prototypical crusade. That was one of the first or earliest callings where a pope wanted a crusade, but it didn't manifest.
Hmm.
But then it finally did in 1095. So I'll leave it there for now. See if you have any questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, you touched on several important points there. I think, first of all, right, like 4 out of the 5 original apostolic sees were conquered by the Muslims within a couple hundred years of the rise of Muhammad and of Islam. I mean, it really is. We consider Christendom now like Europe, right? But I mean, like you mentioned, I mean, Turkey is where, that's Asia Minor. I mean, that's where Paul preached most of his missionary journeys was through Turkey. So, I mean, this is the cradle really of Christian, the Christian religion and civilization. And so when we discuss and look at the history of Islam and Christianity, I mean, you want to talk about a statement that's just totally detached from reality. I mean, it could not be further from the truth. 500 years of peace. I mean, it's utterly detached from reality, And so, Yeah, I think I would like to go back to Tours, right? And just how deep the, Umayyad caliphate had pushed into France. I mean, Tours is just, like a couple hour drive to Paris. I mean, they were almost in the heart of
Mhm.
Europe. I mean, it really can't the gravity of the situation really can't be underscored here. So, yeah, if you could just
Yeah. Yeah, so basically, as I mentioned, in 711, the Muslims, entered Spain and conquered it. And again, and it's it's worth actually spending a little time about Spain because another one of those great myths that people like to say is that somehow the Muslims they didn't even really conquer Spain; they just entered it, and the people were tired of the Visigothic nobles, and it sort of collapsed right away, and there was very little bloodshed, and that's sort of how it's presented and implied. But if you look at the sources, as I did, and I think in Sword and Scimitar, I believe chapter 3, I spent a lot of time talking about the early invasion, and it was exactly that. It was an invasion with a lot of, again, the usual horrific massacres. One instance that comes to mind is, they had all these Christians were holed up in the church because they wouldn't resist. They didn't want to convert to Islam, and the Muslims torched it and burned them alive. Okay, so yeah, there definitely was resistance to Islam even back then in the 8th century when it first entered. But of course, they continued northward and crossed the Pirin Mountains. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but and entered into France. And again, if you look at the sources, what they were just completely raiding and devastating and enslaving Christians because there was always a premium for white flesh, white slaves. So that was another incentive for them. And they went there. And again, according to the sources, I have it in the book, but something like I believe the chief, the Muslim captain, I think his name was Abdul Rahman, had something like 60,000 fighters, and they were going. They were especially interested in sacking churches and plundering them because churches, of course, had a lot of golden vessels and precious items there. So they were on their way to the I think the church of Martin of Saint Tor. I'm messing it up. It's been so long since I've looked at it. But anyway, that was one of their goals. And then the Franks under Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, he rallied a much smaller army. I think it was maybe 25,000. And anyway, you can look at the story or the battle, but they met and they fought, and it was pretty horrific and a lot of carnage. And it was one of the earliest written about sources in the Latin text that gives a lot of like decent detail compared to the earlier battles. And of course, it was very important because had it not been for that, the Muslims. Here's again what they don't tell you. So on the one hand, they try to present. If you look, and I quote all these academics and encyclopedias saying that the Battle of Tours was just a raid, a large raid. The Muslims just wanted to come and raid and go back. Okay, which yeah, of course, that's always the initial interest. You're
yeah.
raiding. That's the immediate impulse. You're going to get something out of it. But that's what every jihad was. It starts off as a raid, but when they conquer, then it becomes consolidated and part of the ummah. Okay, so I don't know why they're saying that, but there's even evidence that when you look in the Islamic sources, which I quote, that this was sort of a pincer movement because this happened right at the same time or around the same time that Constantinople was being bombarded and attacked in the east by the Caliphate, by the Umayyads. So there was this idea that they wanted to sort of, come in through the east through Europe and the west through France and kind of meet in the middle, and that's the end of Europe. Now Europe has been conquered. So it definitely was a raid for plunder, as all jihad raids are, but the long picture was to conquer and bring it in under the orbit or bring it into the Ummah. That's pretty clear, especially if you look at the Islamic sources, which is why Edward Gibbon famously said something about how had Charles Martel not been successful at the Battle of Tours, the Quran would be preached in Oxford. Now he's writing in the 19th century, and his point is, of course, that when he says that, he means that London would be Islamic. But of course, the Quran is now being preached and taught in Oxford
Yeah,
and all
indeed, right?
throughout the UK, but not by force or conquest, by
Nope.
essentially capitulation. That's a whole other story. So yeah, that's the importance of the Battle of Tours, and that's why it's one of my in Sword and Scimitar. I have 8 battles, and it's the third one that I talk about as highly decisive for that very reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And what was one of the other points you touched on earlier as well, right? Is that when ISIS represents their theology, it is, I mean, it is the historic and accurate representation of Islam, right? I mean, we can look at, and I know people love to quote the earlier sections of the Quran, right, where Muhammad talks, very glowingly about the Torah and the gospel and Christians, right? That they're all people of the book. Well, I mean, you look at the life of Muhammad, he was saying this at a point where his people were not yet in power. And so later on in the Quran, once Muhammad comes to power, right, and he is the dominant authority, all this this people, the book stuff goes out the window. And as you mentioned, right, everyone is given three options: you either convert to Islam, you submit and pay, your jizya as a dhimmi, a special tax, right, that unbelievers would have to pay, or you die. Those are the three options.
Yeah, yeah. It's a lot of people don't want to admit it because the implications are so troubling. But yeah, the Islam espoused and promoted by ISIS is definitely historic Islam, right? What they do, okay, whether the horrific stuff they do and burn people alive and decapitate them and even crucify them, that's what the caliphates did. That's what the sultanates did, and that they were the representatives of Islam. These were the highest authorities, and they had a whole cadre of ulama and sheikhs and muftis validating the savagery that they engaged in: mass slavery, destroying churches and other religious temples. That is the history of Islam, and like I said, it comes out very clearly when you look at the long history. It's just unwavering. It happened everywhere. Okay, even in Russia, which when you hear of the Tatar yoke, which is a Mongolian, the Golden Horde, as it's called, well, they were Muslims, and once that group of Tatars or Mongols became Muslim, immediately the same sort of religious hostility, that dynamic becomes evident against the Russians. Okay, so the same things that we're talking about. So wherever that is Islam, it is unwavering. And the point, of course, about Muhammad, yeah, this is how Muslims themselves have articulated and understood the great contradictions in their holy book, the Quran. Because yes, the Quran, if you want to find peaceful, tolerant verses, they're there, and you want to find the very violent ones, they're there too. So Muslims immediately were like, well, so what are we going to do? Which do we follow? And this is where the doctrine of al-nasikh wal-mansukh, which means the abrogated and the abrogator, came up. And in a nutshell, it's basically whatever revelations, verses Muhammad proclaimed or they came to him as it's understood, later supersede the former or abrogate them. Okay, yes. So as it happens, all the early peaceful verses came to him earlier in his career when he was in Mecca, and he was completely outnumbered, and he was not a fighter, and he was not a warrior or a warlord. And if anything, he was the one who was being harassed and possibly even persecuted, as they say, Muslims. Okay, and so that's where you get, you have your religion, I have mine, let's live in peace. Then he goes to Medina and becomes essentially a warlord, starts, waging caravan raids and terrorist attacks, essentially, as he calls them, one by one. And he becomes stronger and stronger, and more people rally to him. And then he starts getting the violent verses, right? And these are known as the Medinan verses, the later verses. And those are the ones like Quran 929, which says, fight the people of the book until they convert to Islam or pay jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, or of course die. And also Quran 9:5, which is slay the pagans and the idolaters wherever you find them. Okay, but if they become Muslim, then let them go. All right, and these are known collectively, actually, in Arabic as the sword verses. And these are much, much later in his career. So they abrogate and supersede the peaceful ones. That's how Islamic law understands it. But there's another dimension to all this, which few people understand, and that's that, yeah, the entire Quran is still applicable to Muslims based on their circumstances. So if they find themselves living like Muhammad when he was in Mecca in his early career, when he's weaker and outnumbered, then they can embrace and preach those verses about tolerance and cooperation, and you have your religion in mind. So if you're a Muslim living in America, you should preach that, okay? But once the circumstance changes and you're in the majority, well, now just like Muhammad switched his tactics once he became stronger, and now you got the new revelation from Allah, which is to go on the war path, then you should do that. And there's a funny anecdote I'll close with, because I've shared it before, but I think it's very telling. When I worked at the Library of Congress, there were a lot of Muslims there, and one of them was we were on friendly terms, he and I, and we would always debate religion, engage in interfaith dialogue. And I brought all this up. I mentioned this whole issue of abrogation because he was quoting the peaceful verses,
Sure.
and I told him, well, that's the Meccan verses. Those are they've been abrogated and superseded by the violent ones. And he would argue back and forth, um, and then finally he got really frustrated and he just said, well, what do you want? I'm in Mecca. Right? And his point is he's living in this is in Washington D.C., the USA. So for him, that's like Muhammad in Mecca. I'm outnumbered. I'm weak. Of course, I'm going to preach peace and tolerance. Okay, so I found that very telling when he was finally, pushed up against the wall that he admitted it like that.
Yeah, no, indeed. And, another thing that complicates this situation, right, for those who are not familiar with Islam, they are allowed to lie to non-believers, right? It's called taqiyya. So, even the statements that they make cannot be taken at face value. It is when we talk about really deception, right, as a means of warfare, Islam and the Caliphate are expertly trained in this.
Yeah, yeah. Takea, and there's many other doctrines of deception that I've traced over the last 2 decades, and I've written about. And the long and short of it is Islam is very much a practical religion in that whatever is convenient for the Muslim, especially vis-a-vis the infidel, because the infidel is by default the enemy. So anything that can help the Muslim, even though it's normally a sin, let's say, like lying is not obviously it's frowned upon in Islam in general, but there are caveats and ways to get around it, especially so if it's the infidel, you don't even need a caveat. Of course, you can lie because he's persecuting you, and you're good. You're the Muslim. He's evil by nature. So of course, if you want to say anything you want, you can do it. And this is again in the Quran. This is what justifies taqiyya. There's several verses, but the main one is 328, which in the context of telling Muslims you cannot be friends with non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians. You can only have enmity and hatred for them, which is Quran 64 says that. It says unless you do it by way of precaution. That's the English translation, one of them, of the word taqiyya, which means fear. Okay, so if you are friends and allies with them, Jews and Christians and non-Muslims in general, be just for the heck of it, well, you're going to hell for that. But if you're doing it because you're like Muhammad in Mecca, you're weak, okay, and you still have your true Islam in your heart, then that's acceptable. Okay, so that's just one verse, but there's a lot of hadith as well. But there's a lot of lesser known, lesser doctrines that the people know that I find also interesting. One of them, for example, which Muslims can use with fellow Muslims, this is what I mean by the elasticity of Islam, is called tawriyah in Arabic. And what that means is as long as your words are not technically a lie, but they are formulated the way you formulate them so you can get out of a bind or lie, then it's okay. And so the example, for example, is let's say someone asks me, hey, can I borrow a dollar? Right? And I have a dollar in my pocket, but I say, I don't have a penny on me. Okay, so that's true. I don't have a penny on me. Okay, and so, but he understands it as me saying I don't have any money on me, even though I have a dollar in my pocket. That's not a lie. Okay, according to a lot of Islamic clerics and sheikhs. Okay,
Lying by
so
omission, essentially.
yeah, yeah. Well, it by omission, but also by sort of a word play.
Hmm.
A double entendre. What you're doing is you're, you know, or another one I saw Muslims were boasting about how like uh, I don't know. It just in other words, it allows for a lot of lying, but you just have to be creative about it. Okay, the words have to sort of fit the meaning, and then it's legit. You didn't sin. Okay. But anyway, so like I said, that's for Muslim on Muslim deception. But when it comes to the non-Muslim, remember Muhammad himself famously said, "War is deceit." Okay, well, all right, and but the first premise is Muslims and non-Muslims are constantly at war, thanks to Islam, because it doesn't have to be waged, but the hostility has to always be there. So this is why caliphates, when they were powerful and they would always wage jihad against their neighbors. Sometimes it was required, according to a lot of the clerics, twice a year, a raid. Okay, But if they're weak, right, then you're not going to do that because it's suicidal. So this is why Saudi Arabia can be our friend and ally, even though it teaches all its Muslims what I'm talking about. What Saudi Arabia and these Gulf nations teach is basically what ISIS teaches. ISIS are called Salafists, and Saudis are called Wahhabis. But move beyond that, they're the same exact thing, which are they're literalists, they're Hanbalists. They follow the Hanbali school of law, which is very, very literal and fundamentalist. So, well, how do they, Saudi Arabia, get past all this? Well, they know they're weak right now. They're dependent on the West, etc. So they're not going to call for a full-out jihad. But and so that too is dissembling. In fact, I once translated after one of the many famous Saudi and U.S. sort of meetings, and they dance together, waving swords, and imply that they're great friends. I came across on an official Saudi website a fatwa, which is basically a decree reminding Muslims that they have to hate non-Muslims, even if they live among them, even if they benefit off of them, like in the West. And of course, they can do taqiyya. They don't have to show the hate, but in their heart, they have to hate them. Okay, so that's what non-Muslims have to contend with. There's a lot of layers going on in regards to the deception, and your average Westerner is so beyond naive they can't even begin to imagine what's going on right underneath their nose. And that's one of the main reasons we are where we are.
Yeah, no, indeed. I think for the average person, right, it's just difficult to imagine engaging in that level of constant deception, right? I mean, it's difficult, and I mean, like we see in most Muslims in the West are peaceful, right? I mean, it's difficult for them to kind of live with some of this cognitive dissonance as well as you were mentioning earlier with your acquaintance there. So, it really
Yeah.
is. It is so important to discuss these issues, right? And again, one of the things I like to do as well is to go to those firsthand, those primary sources, right? Because people have a lot of opinions on the matter, but once you read the words of some of these firsthand and eyewitnesses to these attacks and these monstrosities, it is just it's difficult to stomach the kind of lies that this PhD was spouting, right? 500 years of peace. I mean, it is again, not to get graphic, but the most horrific violence perpetrated against peaceful missionaries and Christians, constant raids and warfare, leading up to 1095, right? Putting aside the issue of whether you think, the ecclesiastical authorities should have that ability to call, a crusade or something of the like, right? Even putting that aside, just from a geopolitical standpoint, right? Like this was hundreds of years of invasions, of warfare, and at this point, I very much see it as self-defense. I don't know your opinion on the matter. I would assume similarly.
Yeah. By the way, I just realized my microphone wasn't connected. I just connected it right now. Was I sounding okay earlier?
Yeah, no, it sounded fine.
Okay. Do I sound better now? Does it even matter?
I can't tell too much of a difference, no.
Okay. Okay. Good. And maybe if it requires any adjusting, you can do it on your end. But yeah. So self-defense. That is the whole point, right? That is most people don't realize. Even the Crusades were seen as self-defense. Okay. But it doesn't look that way if you don't know the context and the background, which most people don't. And all you see is large bodies of Christians traveling from Europe to so-called the Muslim world, which you also don't know used to be Christian and was conquered. Because one of the most simple tenets of just war theory, which is grounded in Christian teaching, including New Testament teaching, but of course Old Testament as well, is that the liberation of formerly Christian regions. And so, like I just pointed out, all of the Islamic world is built atop non-Muslim blood and land, but especially the North Africa, Middle East region and the Holy Land that was all Christian in the 7th century, Christian ruled and Christian majority people. So the Crusaders and the Europeans were aware of that. But then the other main condition of just war theory was also satisfied in that they were attacking and killing Christians, as I mentioned, both Eastern Christians and Western European pilgrims who were going there. So absolutely, even the Crusades were seen as a sort of self-defense and fit in perfectly with just war theory.
Yeah, no, certainly. And man, I think that's probably a good place to segue into, the modern persecution that's going on in many of these same places. I know you talked about your roots as a Coptic Christian. and some of the persecution in Egypt, but it's not just Egypt. I mean, all across Africa over the last decade, the attacks and violence against Christians have been intensifying. And so I know you're one of the few people out there with a large platform talking about this issue, sir. So yeah, just why are more Christians not talking about what's going on here?
It ranges from probably the fundamental reason is Christians in the West and people in the West in general talk only about what the media wants them to talk about. So whatever the media on any given day decides this is what we're going to talk about, Taylor Swift said something, well, everyone rallies and talks about it either from a pro or con angle, right? You either are angry about it or you're happy about it. So a lot of it has to do with stupidity, obviously. That's the number one reason. And of course, the media doesn't want to talk about this particular topic for obvious reasons, because A, it makes Muslims look bad, and B, it makes Christians look like victims when we all know Christians are the evildoers, of course, thanks to Hollywood. So that's one of the main reasons. I would say that's the fundamental reason. I think a lesser reason is amongst certain denominations in the West. They look at the Christians over there. A lot of them are Catholic and Orthodox, for
Yeah.
example, and they don't count them as real Christians. Okay, I think this would be the case with the so-called evangelicals. That's just to them, they're more interested in eschatology and bringing Christ for 1,000 years of reigning, and et cetera, all
Sure.
stuff that no one has ever heard of historically until about a century ago. So to them, their mindset, their entire paradigm is very, very different.
And I know eschatology is one of the subjects we've touched upon quite a bit here, and it really is one of the things that really stood out to me when I was, researching the history of dispensationalism is just how this has been wielded as a really a geopolitical tool. And you
Yeah,
talk about just, I mean, Jesus says in John 15, right, that we will know who is a true Christian by how they demonstrate love for other Christians, right? And I can't think of a greater indictment against most American churches than that they are utterly uncaring of what's happening to our brothers and sisters across the world.
yeah. And isn't it funny? These same Christians in America, for example, are the first ones who will condemn the Crusaders for not being true Christians. When those guys, the Crusaders, sold everything, lost so much when they left Europe. A lot of them, you have to remember, were rich nobles, and they donated, sold their properties just so they can raise armies to go there, and a lot of them died. Okay, so to your soft, effete, living in the world, Western Christian who you can't differentiate from a secular person, they feel holier than thou against those silly crusaders, those evil crusaders who actually died, defending fellow Christians. That's quite the irony, I think.
Yeah, it's very easy to piety signal in your air conditioning, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
Going back to prophecy, I just
yeah,
find it amazing that these are the same Christians today who claim they're biblical Christians, and they seem to overlook that Jesus told them nobody knows when the second coming is. Okay, don't even bother. For me, it's anyone. This whole sort of prophecy industry, which I'm not too fond of. I'm something
yeah,
of a
industry
partial
is a great
preterist
term.
myself. What's that?
I said industry is a great term.
Yeah, and I'm a partial preterist, which means I think most of the prophecies in the Bible were fulfilled
Yeah, I'm as
already.
well.
Yeah, it's the only sensible thing. And most church fathers and theologians throughout history, that's how they saw it too, because that's the truth. But to me, I just, whenever I find these people who are just so caught up on prophecy and when the second coming and et cetera, here, let me give you the real prophecy you need to know. And right now, I'm going to prophesy when you and I are going to see the second coming. It's when you die. And that's going to happen. That I can assure you is going to happen. It could happen today. It could happen decades from now, depending on your age. But once you die, that is the essential equivalent of the second coming, because now it's just like a scroll turning over. You enter into the new real realm. Okay, so that's the only thing I think people should be cognizant of when they're very eager to learn when the second coming is. It's when you die, and that is going to happen. So don't worry about trying to piece it together and reading all these silly books and following all these silly so-called theologians, Christian theologians, who want you to believe this is when the second coming is going to happen, etc.
And one of the things that people just seem to miss in all this speculation, right, is that Jesus very intentionally did not disclose this information to even the apostles because they didn't need
Yep.
to know. They didn't need to be concerned about these things because when you have that, that final date on the calendar, right? I mean, it does work, some complacency. I mean, we certainly see that in the American church, right? Just
Yeah.
waiting to be raptured so we don't have to deal with any of these problems. Well,
So when you talk about why Christians don't care, here's another one that I hear often, and it's probably from the people that you're describing. When, let's say, if I talk about the persecution of Christians, a lot of them will say, "Yeah, that's too bad, but don't worry, Jesus is coming and He'll fix it." Okay. Well, I mean, talk about taking the easy route. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to be inconvenienced, even though Jesus actually was all about telling me to do stuff. Okay, to do something for your fellow man. But now I'm just going to sit back because Jesus will take care of it.
Yeah, I think there's a parable about a wicked servant sitting on his talents. Maybe I'm misremembering something
Yeah,
though.
yeah, yeah. No, that's yeah.
Oh yeah, indeed. So, and I know you mentioned it earlier, right? But another important thing to remember in this context, so frequently the Crusades are painted in this colonial or imperialist light. But the vast majority of the European nobles did not go. I mean, I think only like 10% of the European nobles went on the Crusades. And again, many of them were bankrupted, entire households wiped out, right? I mean, it is just like you saw in, World War I, right? These great European conflicts. I mean, just entire families wiped out. So it is, the Crusaders went there at great cost, great personal cost financially, and
Yeah.
obviously physically as well.
And now they present it as usual. The lies are always exact 180 degrees, and now it's presented as they went exclusively to make money and plunder, and because they were so-called second sons. This was sort of the thesis advanced by Stephen Runciman, Crusades historian, and everyone followed it, which is basically all these second disinherited sons have decided to go crusading so they can carve out their own little kingdoms. But that's been debunked recently by other academic crusade historians to show you that it's the exact opposite. It's what we just said, which is they were actually bankrupt, most of them, and they lost everything, and they knew they would. And one of the verses while we were talking that they often would mention in the context of going on a crusade is the one where Jesus talks about loving your fellow man and loving God. So to them, loving your fellow man meant I'm going to go and help the Christians in the East who were being slaughtered, and loving God meant I'm going to go and liberate the Holy Land because Holy Land and places were important to Christians back then, and you can't have the Holy Sepulchre being desecrated by Muslims and infidels and destroyed. The place where Christ was buried and rose. So that was one of their expression of loving God as well.
Yeah, it really is just it's a travesty how these great heroes of the faith have been painted in modern times and how so many Christians have just, totally accepted this, right? Instead of like digging just a little bit deeper, it's like, oh, well, I disagree with you on theology or eschatology or, soteriology. So, I guess you're not really a Christian. It's just, I'll never understand that.
Yeah, today's modern Western Christians, I call them doormat Christians. They're just they're basically created by evil forces that hate Christianity, because the kind of Christianity that they espouse is the sort of Christianity that is very accommodating to every kind of evil you can imagine. It's doormat Christianity. They think that Christianity and Jesus, his preaching, everything begins and ends with me being tolerant and turning the other cheek and never judging, etc. And that's just not historic Christianity. That's not even biblical Christianity, because what they're doing is they're focusing on certain verses and ignoring others. Okay, I mean, Jesus himself engaged in violence. How's that? Where he
Indeed.
made a cord of whip and whipped people and animals and threw tables. I mean, that's violence. So
Three
even
different
Jesus
times.
himself, what's that?
So three different times.
Yeah, yeah. So, but to your modern day Christian, and a lot of it, I think this sort of non-confrontational Christianity that permeates, especially in the West. I think a lot of it is, on the one hand, it's promoted, obviously, but on the other hand, it's also the easy kind of Christianity. It's, people are making a virtue out of a vice. It's much easier to be non-confrontational, non-judgmental, and just be a doormat than to actually stand up and speak up and, heaven forbid, do something. So I think a lot of it also just has to do with innate cowardice.
Yeah, unfortunately I have to agree with you, right? It really is just the easy way out, and tolerance is frankly just not a Christian virtue. When we
It's
talk
not.
about God being love, the way that we love and the way that God loves is very different. Like he establishes in his word that the way that we love our brothers is we show them their errors, right? We don't just say, hey, you're an error. Just go do what you want to do, right? Like, obviously, not everyone's going to listen, but you at least got to say something. The idea that, just live and let live is, again, totally foreign to the scriptures and obviously historic Christianity.
And a perfect example of that, which really underscores everything we're talking about, including, self-defense and just war is, and when you look at Jesus, right, he performs miracles, he heals people, he does what they want. But then what does he tell them? He always tells them to repent, right? And he tells them change your evil ways, etc. But then when the Roman centurion comes to him and asks him to heal his servant, and Jesus complies, and then Jesus in that instance didn't tell that guy to repent and leave the army, did he? You would think that
faith.
if Jesus was against violence and bloodshed and warfare, if anyone had to repent, it's this heathen Roman centurion who was in charge of, countless, much bloodshed, I'm sure, and everyone knew that, especially in Jerusalem. He didn't tell him that. He didn't say, "Oh, sheathe your sword and leave the army, repent." Right? And I think there's a reason for that. And this is, in fact, what a lot of the early church fathers pointed to as justification, implicit justification for self-defense and just war. And John the Baptist did the same thing when soldiers came to him saying, what must we do to be saved? He didn't tell them get out of the army. He said, be content with your wages. Okay, so you can. It's all there in the New Testament. Justifications for self-defense, even aggression. Okay, and intolerance for evil. But again, for your average modern day Christian, it's been weaponized. The sort of the turn the other cheek aspect has been weaponized to turn them into doormats. If I hate Christianity and I hate Christians, I would love the kind of Christianity that exists today in the West because it's so accommodating and it lets these Christians think they're Christians, but they're not. And I get away with what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the powers that be love a Christianity that is not a threat to evil. So, a Christianity that just is
That
more than
accommodates
willing
it.
to, accommodates and tolerates it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So now I know as we're, getting closer to the end here, I know we wanted to touch on your new book, The Two Swords of Christ. So, yeah, just to share a little bit of that with us, if you don't mind, what you're going to be diving into.
Sure. Well, yeah, it's very relevant to what we're discussing. And it's basically it's actually part of what I consider a trilogy. So I told you the first one is the Sword and Scimitar. Then the second one, Defenders of the West, the Christian heroes who stood against Islam. And this book sort of does what these two do in its own way. So Sword and Scimitar is just a long history of conflict. The Two Swords of Christ is, and Defenders of the West kind of showcases the heroism of individuals, and that happens as well in Two Swords of Christ. So what that book is about is the two military orders, the greatest Christian military orders, which are the Templars, or the Knights of the Temple, and the Knights of the Hospital, the Hospitallers and Templars. So that's what the book is about. And the title, The Two Swords of Christ, it's sort of a pun. I'm referencing, of course, the verse. I think it's in Luke where Jesus literally, here we go again with, the verses that modern day Christians just completely ignore. But he tells his disciples to sell their garments and go buy swords. And they say, Lord, look, here are two. And he says, that's enough. So, so today, what does that mean to your average Christian? It means absolutely nothing. They'll tell you, oh, this is symbolic. It has absolutely no significance.
Or to
It's
fulfill
certainly not talking
prophecy.
about swords. Yeah. But to earlier Christians, no, Jesus wasn't just talking nonsense. He was actually making a point. So he mentioned swords because he meant swords. And what it meant to them, two swords are enough, is that Christians need two swords. One to fight spiritual evil, which I guess Christians today would agree with, and another one to fight physical, real evil, human evil, okay, in the context of self-defense, crusader logic. So those were the two swords. And if you have that, that is enough, because you're now well prepared to meet both realms, the metaphysical and the physical. So that's why I called it the Two Swords of Christ. But it was also interesting because there were more military orders, but the two primary ones who were really dominant were the Templars and the Hospitallers. So in many ways, they came to represent the two swords of Christ, actually, for me, because they quoted that verse all the time, and others. And so who they were and what the book is about is basically, long story short, they were essentially both of them were monks, monk groups. The hospitals are even older. So it was a modest it was a the hospital was the origins of the hospital, which was again in Jerusalem and trying to help pilgrims who were being attacked and killed. And they eventually found out we have to be militarized. We have to fight back rather than sitting around and waiting for Christians to get mauled, which they would by Muslims. Okay, why don't we actually go and defend them? So that's what the Templars were, and they're the first military order. They wanted to defend Christian pilgrims who were being attacked even after Jerusalem was secured. And the hospitals, it was the same thing, but they became militarized later. So the book really looks at the theological underpinnings of militant Christianity as expressed in these two military orders. And it also looks, of course, at their history, their entire history. Basically, that's what the book is. This book is actually my longest. It's over 500 pages. I went a little overboard with it. And it's also the book that is, I've written a lot in my books. You'll get a lot of snippets about the Crusades, but this one's the most focused on the Crusades because that's what they were. They were the basically the crack units of the Crusades. So you have to talk about really the Crusades whenever you talk about them. Yeah, so that's basically what the book is about, and I think it's going to be very shocking and disturbing, especially to the sorts of Christians that we've been discussing, who think they can't even open their mouth and say anything against evil, let alone do something about it. They're going to be shocked at what these men thought and how they believed, and how they were a lot more pious than most modern day Christians. And there's the kick in the head, right? That guys like that who are constantly on their hands and knees praying were also fighting and killing, and they didn't find any contradiction in the twain.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really is almost like a Marcionite kind of mentality. The idea that oh, well, Jesus is loving and peaceful, and certainly, right, like we should want and desire those things, but we also live in an evil and fallen world. And I mean, please, Christians, crack open your Old Testament sometime. Particularly the Mosaic Law expressly includes the right to self-defense.
And when did
So,
Jesus ever abrogate that? To go back to the idea of abrogation, did
yeah,
Jesus ever
indeed.
say, "Oh, that part is gone"? No.
Yeah, I mean, it's not loving to just allow your family, other Christians, right? I mean, just to be butchered and massacred. I mean, no one would do that for their own family, I know, right? And so when it comes to our brothers and sisters, why would we accept that?
Well, like I told you, because it's the easy way. It's a pretext. Rather than inconveniencing yourself and having and here's the funny thing, it's not like the West has to do what the Crusaders did. It's not like we need to sell our homes and go travel on foot thousands of miles to help. It's as simple as getting our policy makers to threaten a Muslim country with sanctioning, and they'll stop it. Right? It's that simple.
Yeah,
But
or
that
cutting
it's
off
not even worth
the
even mentioning.
funds.
What's
Yeah, I
that?
mean, I said we're cutting off the funds as well. I mean, we
Yeah,
have
or that as well. In other words, it's very, very simple to
yep.
do, but that's how. And this is what I mean. It's just there's no interest, and I mean, look, it's very hard to get into the mindset of the types of Christians we're talking about, but they're just not Christians. That's the bottom line because they don't follow. They don't even understand what historic Christianity is. They follow sort of a man-made new interpretation that just is. A lot of them and some of them I see are so beyond bizarre, and usually those are the kinds of Christians who think they're the only Christians and everyone else isn't. So it's really ironic.
Oh yeah, I could tell you some stories, some of the stuff I've seen in my circles, but
Yeah. No,
no, yeah.
I can imagine. I've seen it too.
Yeah, it really is just a hyper fixation on what's to come and totally ignoring what's around us.
Yeah.
Um, this has been one of my constant criticisms against dispensationalism and, this, yeah, indeed, much of futurism, right? Not, exclusively. There are those futurists still who realize what's at stake here, but ultimately, this theology is one that just breeds complacency and fatalism, and that is just nowhere in the writings of Jesus. So we're to work, we are to occupy, right? The idea that we're just going to sit on our behinds and wait till we all get raptured away is just, I really can't understand. It's a
It's just
fantastic deception.
To me, that those Christians represent those who, who will come and say, "Lord, Lord, we did miracles in your name," and He's going to say, "I never even knew you." Okay, that's that group of Christians, in my opinion.
That's some of the scariest verses in the Bible right there.
Yeah, and look at what it talks about. The people who are like that are the ones who did miracles. In other words, they were the ones who really seemed to be as Christian as possible. They're actually engaged in the supernatural, and yet he never knew them. So that's why, though, oftentimes I also say, the Christians who wear their Christianity on their sleeve are also, they kind of remind me of that too, because they're more interested in sort of, showing you that they're Christian rather than just being a Christian. Remember the verse about, don't let your right hand and left hand know what they're doing.
Indeed. Yeah, it's very performative, right? And it's like,
Yeah,
if you're a Christian, you shouldn't have to tell anyone. People will know. People will see something different.
right.
Yeah. No, man, we've touched on so many great topics today. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to cover or discuss.
No, I think this was pretty good, pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, yes, sir, absolutely. So, would definitely love to have you back once the book comes out. We can touch on that and go a little bit more in depth. I love theology, and certainly always excited to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to.
Sounds good. Well, just let folks know where they can find your work and your book, The Two Swords of Christ, coming out November 25th. You can get at all major retailers.
Yeah, the one-stop place for me is my website, raymondibrahim.com, RaymonDibrahim.com. And it's kind of under construction, so there's a few, quirks not working correctly, but you can find links to my like Twitter and other social media, I think, and you'll see a list of all the books there too. And you can get them all directly from Amazon. You can also get them from my website signed as well through there. And the new book comes out November 25th, so next month, pretty soon. And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, well, once again, sir, thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy man, and I really can't recommend the books to the audience highly enough. He is one of the best historians on this subject, and I just really, once again, thank you, sir, and God bless.
Yeah, thanks, Scipio. God bless.